Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to Rocky River United Methodist Church. My name is Reverend Daniel Bogre and I am the senior pastor here. The other pastor I serve along with is Pastor Paul Bennett. He's in the back, and we're so glad that all of you have come out on a chilly but spring Sunday afternoon for a wonderful program. Welcome you to the Mary Ann and Richard Cavicchi Christian Education Seminar, our second annual. We're glad that all of you were able to make it. Some housekeeping things before we go ahead and get started. If you are a guest with us and have never been in our facility before, there are restrooms just down these stairs and to your right, and there's ones on the same level where you don't need to use stairs out those doors and to the right down the ramp. So you're invited to use those if you need to do that while we are here today. I'd like to open with a prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Cavicchi to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Will you please pray with me? Lord, we thank you for another opportunity to be the church, not just on Sunday morning, but on a Sunday afternoon, as we hear a story about how you've worked in someone special's life, throughout their life, through the highs and the lows and the twists and the turns, and in the midst of it, you were real and evident. So Lord, we ask that you would be just that this afternoon as we meet, that your presence would be real and evident in his words, in our meeting, in our fellowship over our meal, that we would see you in so many different ways, real and active in our midst. Lord, we gather with open hearts and open minds to hear your message for us today, that we truly might be transformed and not be the same people that we were when we entered in. Lord, bless this time together. We raise it to you for your honor and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, welcome. Turn it over to Elizabeth Cavicchi.
Welcome. We're all deeply anticipating today's session, the exchanges and questioning in the life of faith. Thanks to all of you for bringing your lively minds, reflective spirits, and emerging questions. I thank those who worked to make today's seminar happen. For enthusiasm and support throughout, I thank Pastor Bogre, Pastor Bennett, Sherry Schwartz, Rachel Burns, and the church office staff. I thank church members who met regularly across the year to envision this seminar, including a lively meeting that convened together in this room with Mark Collier, a preliminary seminar where we generated questions. Diane Dickon designed the attractive announcements, and Twyla Sales sustained our organizational work throughout. Mary Ann Cavicchi, my mother here, is beaming this afternoon, and the height of her excitement is for welcoming Mark Collier. She is eager for everything that Mark will engage us with next, and for your personal and community questioning that will follow Mark's presentation. My mother conceived the idea of inviting a speaker, scholar, facilitator here to engage you all with how religious thinking, learning, and research can deepen and move our lives of community, faith, and service. In fulfilling her aspiration last May, many of you joined us here for our first seminar program with Professor Jennifer Hurt of Yale Divinity School. She engaged us with the hospitality of abundant life, delving into aspects ranging from interfaith dialogue to the criminal justice system. Today is the second annual meeting of the seminar in Christian education in my parents' honor. This seminar honors my parents' long-time participation in this church and wider community. And this seminar is for you, for developing your lives in community and the future. As written in your bulletins, the seminar carries the vision to provide opportunities for growth in the aspects of discipleship identified by the United Methodist Church: prayer, presence, gifts, and service. Also to be open to all, to encourage dialogue among people of different perspectives, and find ways to be in community and serve God, whether it be service of the poor and ill or promoting peace and reconciliation in our community and the world, and to challenge participants to engage in the lifelong journey of education with an open heart and an open mind. The life of the mind and the life of faith interweave for my parents, Mary Ann and Richard, who married in this church 60 years ago. An aeronautical engineer at the lab that then later became NASA, Richard pursued research there for over 60 years. Starting with hand-manipulated slide rule calculation, he advanced to paper IBM cards and printouts, then the supercomputer, and finally internet-enabled computing. His curious mind generated surprising questions, ranging from outer space to the Bible. Dad encouraged us children to ask questions. At night, he had question time, where he'd sit at our beds and we could ask any question. In remembering his questioning just a few months past, with imaginative questions that considered multiple alternatives for what might be, we are all very excited for Mark Collier's question session with us today. In small groups after his presentation, he will have us generating, eliciting, and expressing questions. My mother, Mary Ann, was Director of Christian Education here from 1953 to 1970, starting here after her Yale Divinity School graduation. Among the Sunday school teachers already here and who worked for her was Richard Cavicchi, who taught 7th grade boys by examining them on the Bible, even with tests, and playing basketball and getting them out on the track. Bryce Collier and Mark Collier were among the boys to go through this more than mental and spiritual calisthenics with Dad. When Mary Ann initiated the practice of having a youth group, MYF, meet Sunday evenings at this church, the Collier brothers were involved. Bryce returned from college to help with special programs. He knew how to operate the projector. Mark became the first and maybe only youth group member of this church to become a minister. Thrilled by the youth, Mary Ann sought to involve them creatively in discussion, prayer, and active service. In carrying out that relationship with the youth, we are delighted that today's seminar co-meets with the church youth group. Since the lively days when the Colliers, among others, participated in this church youth group, my mother taught adult Bible and Lenten studies, co-founded interracial interchurch church group, and participated in United Methodist Women. And from time to time, in the years, your church has also invited Mark Collier back to lead a session in a study group. Carolyn Rowland recalls the utter intensity of back and forth, give and take questioning, especially between Richard, my dad, and Mark during these sessions. And I hear of such events from a note in my parents' letters. Mark Collier is coming. Hushed awe and vivid excitement all at once, conveying my parents' abiding depth of respect, admiration, and love for Mark. You'll feel that all yourselves within a few moments. Welcome home, Mark. In teaching, my mother sought out scholarly perspectives on the Bible and contemporary human and political issues. In respect of the piles of books that my mother used in preparing for her teaching here at this church, this seminar presents your church library with books for you to borrow and read further. They're over there. And the list is in this bulletin insert. Recommended, all by today's speaker, Mark Collier. These books are accessible reading, whose authors examine and excerpt from their own personal lives in relaying the struggles, transformations, and lasting insights and challenges of spirituality. The book range from ongoing diaries of Thomas Merton's contemplative living to Frederick Buchner's memoirs rediscovering the truths of faith in his personal past, to sermons by Gomes, Mott, and Taylor, grounded in both Bible passages and ordinary experience, to Marcus Borg, who in meeting the historical Jesus raises questions for us all about Christian life. One book author, William Mule, was the Yale Divinity School professor of both my mother and of Mark Collier. Now, when she was his student, my mother was Mary Ann Dameron, a name that gave rise to some teasing for its closeness to a swear word that figures provocatively in Mule's book title, and controversially in today's title that Mark adapted from it, The Life of a Damned Angel. Let Mark share with you the story of that damned angel's life, and in that one story, open for all of us the prospects of realizing in our very own lives the multitudes of depths and growths in faith lived through questioning. First, before Mark comes on, we have a little bit of logistics. Mark will speak. Then he will take some questions. When it's time for us to break from the questions, we will break, and we will all move from here to Wesley Hall. You can stop at restrooms along the way. For a meal, you will sit in tables. They're already arranged. There's a youth table where Mark will sit. And in sitting in tables during the meals, you will generate questions, thinking about the Q&A that we had modeled just briefly here before. And one person at each table should be writing down on the cards, beautiful cards that are placed there, questions. As a part of the group process, you prioritize your questions, and at the end of the meal session, Mark will get back on stage and he will take questions from all of you. Thanks.
gracious and eloquent and very kind. I'm just glad that none of my children were here to hear that, unless they challenge that and say, she's talking about you, Dad, are you sure? That was very, very kind. Thank you so very much. Let me begin by affirming what an honor it is for me to be invited to be here today to offer this presentation to you. It's an honor partly because, as you just heard, and you'll hear some more, Richard and Marianne had a huge influence on my life. And it's an influence that continues to this day and really remains a central theme of my life, as I think you will hear as we go on. And it's also a high honor for me to be invited back to my home church on the assumption I might have something worthwhile to say. I was really comfortable with that until I saw some of my high school classmates arrive. And I already got this terrible, yeah, well, we knew what he was really like. He sounds great now, he talks the talk now, but we knew what he was like. That's a little bit troublesome. Over the course of my career, whenever I had a program to do or a speech to give, I got into developing the habit of always asking myself the following questions as I started to plan it. If this speech or this event is to be a really 100% complete success, what will have happened? I asked myself that same question regarding this presentation, and my answer is as follows. If this event is a 100% success, then every one of you will leave here tonight thinking about, or talking about even better, your own personal faith. That's my goal. Notice I did not say your personal beliefs. Let me offer a simple illustration right here at the start as to my understanding of the difference between belief and faith. Let's suppose that some of us have decided that, and have heard about, a wonderful scenic place somewhere around here, and we've never been there. And people have been there say, you can't miss it, you just got to go. It's just absolutely beautiful. But they warn us it's not an easy walk to get there. You park, and then you walk quite a ways. So let's suppose some of us decide to do that. And we get out of the car, and we start to walk toward where this beautiful scenic route is. And it is a tough walk. And we've been going for a while, and we're getting a bit tired. And suddenly we come, and in the path we're walking, there's a sudden drop-off. And it drops down 20 yards down, and it's at least 10 yards across where we can see the path continues on the other side. The question is, how do we get there? So we all gather around, we talk, and somebody says, hey, wait a minute, look here. And we walk down, and across that gap is a rickety old wooden bridge made of rope and wood. And it kind of creaks as the wind blows it, and it's cracking, and we're not sure it's real sturdy. Person number one goes up to it and says, you know, I think this bridge will hold us. And he steps back to look at it further. Person number two goes up to it and says, you know, I think this bridge will hold us. And she starts to walk across. Person number one is belief. Person number two is faith. To put it most simply, it's my conviction that beliefs ultimately are intellectual affirmations, such as, I believe in God, or I believe Jesus was the Son of God. Faith, on the other hand, is what you have when you shape your life based on what you say you believe. You can often tell a person's faith by the risks they're willing to take in their life. When, for example, they love someone who is very unlovable. Or when, for example, they take an unpopular stand on some issue because they believe that's the stand God calls them to make. That is what I mean when I say that my goal is to have you reflecting on your faith, not your beliefs. Now that approach offers a clue as to how we can come to talk about a clear understanding of our faith. I have been heavily influenced for a long time by the writing of Frederick Buechner. Some of his books are right there. And have found his advice on the matter we're talking about to be very helpful. Buechner is very straightforward. He says, if you really want to come to understand your own personal faith, you should, to use his phrase, listen to your life. We should look into the mirror and see who we are and how we have come to be who we are. And when we do that, that will tell us the true story of what our faith really is. I want to clarify one more assumption on my own understanding of this process. When you and I look into that mirror, who or what are we looking at? We are looking, I assume, for all of us at an ordinary human being. I might go even as far as to say, when God looks at us, what does God see? There's a whole branch of theology called theological anthropology that has written volumes on attempting to answer this question. But the most direct and insightful, and for me the most enjoyable answer by far I have, was written by my seminary advisor, Bill Meal. You will hear more about Bill later on. But first let me share with you his understanding of what God sees when he sees each of us. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I have since I first read it. This is a foreword to his book, one of the books over there. Many years ago, when my wife and I had a son in nursery school, we received at his hands one day a message that chilled our blood. It was a mimeographed note which announced a Christmas pageant and urged all parents to avail themselves of this great cultural opportunity. Since Mrs. Meal and I feel about Christmas pageants the way rats are reputed to feel about sinking ships, we began straight away, as the Bible has it, to make excuses. When we learned, however, that our 4-year-old was to play the part of a shepherd in the manger scene, we decided it was as foolish to make a principle of not attending Christmas pageants as it would be to make a principle of attending them, and agreed that if we happened to be in the neighborhood that day, we might stop by. That morning, after canceling 2 classes, I happened to be in the neighborhood. And when I entered the auditorium, I discovered to my not very great surprise that my wife was already seated in the front row. The teacher in charge announced that the manger scene would now be presented by the connecting class. The house lights dimmed, and the school janitor sneaked on stage with a box of straw. Then from the wings came 3 Virgin Marys, who arranged themselves coyly around the creche and waved to their relatives in the audience. A vague uneasiness came over me. I feared for a moment that we were about to witness the promulgation of a new dogma, group childbirth. But my wife, who was somewhat more sophisticated than I am in such matters, pointed out that the school had, over the years, accumulated 3 costumes for the Virgin Mary. So, by the strange logic which seems to govern these pageants, there had to be 3 virgins. The virgins were closely followed by 2 Josephs, who took up sullen postures near a box of straw. Next came the angels, about 20 little girls dressed in white gowns and sporting immense gauze wings. They deployed themselves with suspicious symmetry across the platform. Then the shepherds appeared, an equal number of small boys dressed in burlap sacks and carried an assortment of sticks which were supposed to be crooks. At this point, a most unfortunate discovery came to light. In order to be sure that the angels and the shepherds would strike in a pleasantly balanced array on stage, the drama coach had made a series of chalk marks on the floor, a circle for each angel and a cross for each shepherd. She had urgently instructed the children that they were all to find and stand on the appropriate symbols. But, unwisely, this marking had been done when the pupils were wearing their ordinary clothes, shorts, skirts, and overalls. When the angels came on in their flowing robes, each of them covered not only her own circle, but the adjacent cross as well. The shepherds began looking for their places. Angels were treated as they've never been treated before. And at last, one little boy, who had suffered all such nonsense that he could handle, turned toward the rings where the teacher in charge was going quietly mad and angrily announced, "These damned angels are following up the whole show. They've hidden all the crosses." Needless to say, his mother and I were greatly embarrassed. The pageant is over, the embarrassment is past, and the child is now a man, Bill writes. But his furious proclamation still strikes me as a trenchant comment on the human predicament. We are indeed damned angels. We possess gifts and insights which we turn to works of destruction, and we are victims of burdens and infirmities which become occasions for glory. With the best intentions, we do the worst thing and then perform miracles of love almost by accident. Our flesh drives and afflicts us from birth to death, but we have the gall to affirm that it once sheltered the eternal. There are men wise and good enough to walk with God and see visions of heaven. I've had to be content with damned angels and the facts of life. Well, here's what I propose to do. I propose that putting Beekner and Meal together, we listen to the life of one damned angel to get a sense of the faith that sustains that person, in order for all of you to understand how you might reflect on your faith by listening to your life. I propose that we listen to the life of the damned angel that is me, with the hope that it might help you listen to your life as well. I will begin with sharing with you some episodes of my life and experiences that have directly shaped my life and my faith, and then conclude by offering how all of them together have begun to shape my faith. I was born at Southwest General Hospital. I've never set a record in my life except for that. I was the second fattest baby ever born there at that time, weighing in at, 11 pounds, 14 ounces, wasn't it? Yes, yes, yes. And God loved my mother. She never held it against me. It was just absolutely amazing. My family consisted of my father, Maynard, names I think many of you know, my mother, Jean, and my brother, Bryce. Bryce was 4 years older than me. When I was about 4 years old, we moved from there to Rocky River. As I later came to understand more fully in my life, in keeping with the long-held generational traditions and values of the Collier family, one of the first things my parents did after they made that move was to come and join this church. Except at that time, it was the little church up there with the Sunday school downstairs, and I think it's now the chapel upstairs or something like that. My memory of those Sunday mornings that we would come first for Sunday school class, my dad would drop Bryce and me off, and then we'd go to the worship service after that. I have two dominant memories of those Sunday school classes in the grade school time. I remember some wonderfully kind and loving teachers. And I remember memory work. I remember we had to memorize and recite the 10 Commandments or the Beatitudes, and we also, when you're really advanced, you had to know all the books of the Bible in order. I remain deeply grateful for those kind and loving teachers, and I always will be. Then, and I may now, having heard her introduction, may not have this right, but just go with this. Then, I believe it, let's say the 7th grade, maybe the 8th grade. I walked into that Sunday school class, and for the very first time that we met, and I saw this young couple sitting there. Their names were Richard and Mary Ann Cavicchi. Quite literally, that Sunday school class set me on the path that I still walk to this day. Let me try to summarize this way. I had learned by the time that I made it to that class from my previous classes when I was younger, that to be a Christian meant to love God and to love other people. But Richard and Mary Ann added a whole new dimension to my faith. They taught us that in addition to loving God with our hearts, we should also love God with our minds. In other words, entering church should never mean checking your brains at the door. They encouraged us to think about what we really believe and why we believe it. And most of all, they encouraged us to ask questions. Come on, Mrs. Cavicchi, did Jesus really walk on water? Mr. Cavicchi, did Jesus really get up and walk around and talk to people after he was crucified? Did God really make the world in 7 days, and did the snake really come in and talk to the bird, to Adam and Eve there about kind of like, chatting with them? Now, I can't speak for anyone else in that class, but those discussions absolutely captured me. From that point on through high school, I read everything I could about those kinds of questions that would be appropriate for a high school student. And somewhere along that way, I remember it was after a sermon by Reverend Bob Scully, I decided I wanted to become a minister. Then came the time for me to decide the question about where I would go to college. Now, my father, my uncle, my 2 cousins had all attended Ohio Wesleyan. And when I was a senior at Rocky River High School, Bryce was a senior at Ohio Wesleyan also, and just been accepted into medical school. In addition to that, When Bryce was a freshman, he was elected president of the freshman dorm and president of the freshman class. And when he was a senior, he was president of the whole student body. Let's just say in one of the more courageous decisions of my life, I opted not to go to Ohio Wesleyan. And I struck off on my own to DePaul University in Indiana. The entire 4 years at DePaul had a huge impact on me in many ways, but I would mention just 4 that I particularly recall. I decided to major in religion, thinking I was going to go to seminary. There were 5 members of the religion department at that time, and that was my first exposure to people who were brilliant scholars of religion, and at the same time, very serious, devout, loving Christians. I decided I wanted to be just like them. That to this day, I think of them and the way they taught and the way they lived, and I cannot ever express my gratitude for them. That year, I also took my first course in Bible. Now, we don't have the time for me to walk you through a whole course in the Bible, but I do want to mention 2 things that particularly stood out to me. In the very first class, the professor said to us, do not think of the Bible as a book. Think of the Bible as a library of books. There's all kinds of literature in it. There's history, there's biography, there's poetry, there's theology, and there is myth. Now let me quickly jump to the last one, the word myth. I should add, by the way, that he was particularly thinking of the creation myths. I need to point out that. But let me make a distinction between a fairy tale and a myth. I assume many of you know Greek myths are considered some of the most important, insightful literature ever written. A fairy tale is meant to entertain. A myth is told because the truth it seeks to convey is so profound and so important and sometimes so complex that the only way to really communicate it is to do it by a story. So for me, the creation stories, I'm personally convinced the creation stories were never, ever intended to describe how creation took place. They were intended to describe why creation took place. And the answer to that is, namely because our God is a God of love, a God of relationships. And thus he created all of us, you and me, so that he could be in a loving relationship with all of us. Needless to say, the current debates about creation isn't being taught in schools as opposed to science, is, to put it mildly, simply beyond my comprehension. I can't imagine in the year 2015 we are still having that same kind of debate. But secondly, beyond all that, what is the Bible? What relevance does it have for us now? This is my own little thing, and I imagine scholars would probably might not agree with me, but I've come to think of it as a collection of the writings with one common theme. It's almost like all of us, I suppose most of us have family albums from our grandparents and people now long gone that we still go back and look to and remember what it means to be a part of that family. Well, that's the way I've begun to see the Bible also. And there is a common theme that runs through it all. That is, in each generation, the people of God are called to ask and to think about, what does it mean for us to be the people of God in our time and in our place? And the Bible is the history of those who, for centuries before us, asked that same question. Well, you and I, in my view, are now at the front of a long, long line of people who have tried to live as God's people in all the years before us. And they relied on the Bible to teach them how to live as God's people in their time and in their place. And that is why I believe we need to read it now so that we can more fully understand what it means to live as the people of God in our time and in our place. Third, in my last semester at DePaul, I took a course in Shakespeare. The professor was the classic TV image of what a college professor should look like. He came in every class with a vest and a suit and a bow tie. He was so eloquent that his lectures were like listening to poetry. And he was uncommonly gracious and kind. Well, most of us in that class were in our last semester at DePaul. And so we were near the end of our time there. And I'll never forget that in one of our final classes with this professor, and don't embarrass me by asking his name because I won't remember it. But anyway, in one of his final classes, he said to us in his wonderful voice, he said, would you mind if I offered a modest suggestion to all of you graduating students as you go out and start to live the rest of your lives? And we all paused. He said, may I suggest to you that when you leave here and get on with your careers and your lives, every now and then, I would suggest you stop and ask yourself the following question. When you know that you're coming close to the end of your life, what criteria will you use to decide whether or not you lived it well? That question haunts me to this day. Just haunts me to this day. The fourth and final episode of my college career that I would describe to you came sometime, I want to say February or March of that senior year. Now, many of you will recall and can identify with, in those days, there were certainly no telephones in dorm rooms. And usually, they were down at the end of each hall. Of course, we never heard of anything called a cell phone, but they were down at the end of the hall. And the one thing you always wanted to avoid when you got a new room, don't get the room close to the phone. Because if the phone rang, then you had to go answer and go get whoever it was that the phone call was for and get them down to take their phone call. Well, I remember that I hardly ever got any calls. And then one night, my roommate and I were sitting there, again, February, March of my senior year, and I heard a voice say, Collier, telephone. And I got up to go, and I remember yet walking toward that phone and thinking, I thought something must have happened to my mother or my father. It's the only thing I could think of why anybody would be calling me. Something bad must have happened. And this was some kind of emergency phone call. When I picked up the phone, the voice on the other end said, hey, Mark, it's Bryce. He said he was calling me to ask me where I planned to go to seminary next year. And the reason he wanted to know, if any of you are younger siblings, take note of this. This is a rare occurrence for a younger sibling. And the reason he wanted to know, because he and his wife, Karen, she was also a medical student, had decided if they could intern at a place close to where I would be going to school. I remember Bryce said to me, he said, you know, Mark, you and I have not had much time together since I left for college 8 years ago. And Karen and I thought it'd be really great if we could be close to where you're going to be and the three of us could spend some time together over the next 3 years. I told him I was going to Yale, and they both did get internships at Yale. Now, I did not have to be at Yale and did not have to be in New Haven until September, but their internship started on July 1st. So they decided to take a week or two off in late June and go up to a cottage that Karen's family owned in Michigan. They invited a couple that Bryce had known at Ohio Wesleyan to join them for the week. After enjoying a very good week and having been a lot of fun, on Saturday they packed up their things and got ready to depart. As a part of that process, there was an aluminum sailboat that had to be dragged onto a storage barn further up off a road of some kind. Karen and Bryce's friends pushed the boat from the back, and Bryce had hold of the rig at the trailer in front and pulled it from the front. At one point, as they were going up this dirt road, Bryce looked up and saw a high power line. And he said, let's make sure this mast doesn't tip and touch that high power line. A few feet further, the left wheel of the trailer went into a rut. The rig tipped over. The mast hit the high power line. Bryce's wife and his two friends were knocked away from the boat. Bryce was thrown across the tongue of the boat and instantly killed. Let's just say that God and I had a very difficult relationship that summer. Largely, I want to be clear, largely as a result of my own immaturity. But it was a difficult time. I had a job downtown and to earn some money for going to seminary. And every night when I came home, before going home, I went and I knelt by Bryce's grave. For weeks, I vented my anger with God. I tried to reason with God. I pointed out how many lives Bryce would have saved had he lived and been able to practice medicine. At some point, I began to use the image of the great hole that had been created because Bryce was gone, and a wonderful doctor would not be here to do any healing. Now, about that time, when I came with that image of this, I called it the gap, this great gap that would now be there because Bryce was gone. Sometime around there, a new thought occurred to me. And it's not like the heavens opened up and said, Mark, could I have your attention for a moment? It was a voice inside me. And the voice said, you know, Mark, if you're so all fired up about this great gap in the world caused by Bryce's death, what do you plan to do to fill it? Now, the whole world can be very grateful that I did not understand that question to suggest that I should go to medical school. But it did occur to me that all of us, every one of us, including me, regardless of our talents or education, all of us, regardless of our station in life, all of us, in whatever role we have, can, if we choose, contribute to the healing of the world. With that thought in mind, I headed off for seminary, which leads to another major theme of my life, one which will now be no surprise to you, and that is I stutter. And that, as I say, is no surprise to any of you who have known me all of my life. When I got to seminary, I learned that all first-year students were required to take a course in public speaking. It was taught by a man, again, whose name you've heard, Bill Neal, author of the book we all love. And in this very first class, Bill told us that during the course of the semester, we would take turns going to the front of the chapel, which is where the class met. And when it was our turn, we were to go up there and conduct a Protestant wedding service with an imaginary bride and groom. And his point was that the wedding service requires several different voices from the minister. Sometimes he or she is talking to just the bride or just the groom. And sometimes he or she is talking to the whole congregation, and so forth. And so Bill wanted us to practice these different voices that we would need for conducting a worship service or a wedding service. Now, it's fairly common for people who stutter to anticipate words they know are going to be difficult for them, or they anticipate will be difficult for them. As soon as I heard that assignment, the word woman came into my head, as in, do you take this woman? So every night, I should say, by the way, I had a single room that year. Every night, after I finished my homework, I sat in a chair, and I sat and read the wedding service out loud over and over again, especially concentrated on the word woman. When my turn came to do the service, and I came to that part of the vows, I said to the imaginary male, do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife? When the service was finished and I was done up front, I went down the side aisle, out the side door, back to my room, and I closed the door. I did not go to dinner that night. I did not want to be around all the talk I assumed and knew would be taking place. Did you hear what Collier did today? Well, it was with him. So I just didn't want to go. The next morning I got up as early as I could, and I went downstairs and I knocked on Bill Neal's door. As I said, he was my advisor. He invited me in, and he asked how he might be helpful to me. I said I wanted to know what procedure I had to follow to withdraw from school. He seemed surprised, and he asked why I wanted to withdraw. And I made some vague comment about how I thought it wouldn't be a good fit for me. I really wasn't sure I really belonged here. At that point, Bill looked right at me, as only Bill could do, and with some modest degree of anger in his voice, he leaned over and he said to me, Mr. Collier, when are you going to face the fact that you have a problem? And when are you going to do something about it? I came this close to saying, problem? What problem? But at that point, I said, as they say, the jig is up. There's no point to trying to play this game anymore. So I said to him, well, what do you mean about do something about it? He replied that Yale had an outstanding speech therapist who had a special interest professionally in stuttering. And if I wanted him to, he would call and set up my first appointment with him. I allowed us how I thought that might be a good idea. The speech therapist's name was Bernard Stoll. I liked him as soon as I met him. In that first appointment, we talked about how we would be working together and so forth. And we set up the time for our next meeting. Just before I left, Stoll said to me, oh, by the way, I have an assignment for you. I said, oh, okay, what is that? Figuring there's an article to read, book to read, something like that. He said to me, what's the biggest class you have at seminary right now? I said, Old Testament. All of us who are first-year students are in that same class. He said, does the professor allow you to ask any questions? And I said, yeah. I said, at the end of each lecture, he takes 10 minutes and we can ask anything we want to ask. He said, good. Here's your assignment. During that question time, I want you to raise your hand and stand up and ask a question, and I want you to deliberately stutter on a word. I had the thought of, sure, yeah, in your dreams, when I heard that. I smiled on the assumption that he was clearly joking. He said, Mark, I am not joking. I want you to do what I said, and I'm not going to let up on you until you do it. Every time I saw him for the appointment for the next several weeks, he asked me if I'd done the assignment, and every week I said, no, no, no. Finally, it became clear to me that he was getting rather irritated with me. So the next time the class met, I forced myself to block on a word, and the forced block quickly became the real thing. And to put it mildly, I could hardly wait to get out of my class that day and go back to my room and stay there for a few hours. At my next meeting with Dr. Stoll, I told him I had done the assignment. And he said to me, when did you do it? And I said, 2 days ago, Tuesday. He said, about what time did you do it? And I thought, come on. I said, it must have been about 10:45. I still remember there was this long pause. I said, you know, Mark, that's really interesting. I don't remember the world coming to an end Tuesday at 10:45. And thus it was I began to understand that there is pain in life. But I also began to learn that it is possible to learn from pain. And I will come back to that later on. Well, there's much more that I could share with you about my experiences that have shaped my life, but in the interest of allowing time for questions and answers, let me briefly mention just a few more such experiences. And then during the discussion time, if any of this I'm about to mention has of interest to you, please feel free to ask me about it. During my second year at Yale, Karen, Bryce's wife, who I then had remarried, wonderful guy. We all liked him. He visited my parents. They loved him. Just a wonderful guy. Anyway, Karen's wife called me and asked me if I was dating anybody. And I chuckled and laughed. I said, Karen, how well do you know me? Of course I'm not dating anybody. She said, well, I've met this nurse. I'm on the ER shift now at the hospital. And she's really nice. She's very smart. She's very good. And I asked her if she would mind if I asked her for her phone number to give to you. And I said, okay, do I have the phone number? And she said, Mark, call her, because she's almost kind of expecting it. I still think that the fact that this nurse was willing to go out with me is one of the great comedies of my lifetime. Let me just leave it there. And if you'd like to hear more about that, particularly the comedy of the first date, I'll feel free to ask about that. Just know that for right now, Marty sits right back down there and has survived over 48 years of marriage with me and still serves as a wonderful mother to our children and to our grandmother to our 6 grandchildren. Second, about this time, during the summer before we were married, I went to Scotland and I became a member of the Iona community. That's a Protestant community devoted to spiritual practices and community service. I would love to tell you about that summer and the huge impact it had on my understanding what it means to live the Christian life. Related to that summer experience, I flew home at the end of the summer. Marty and I were married. We flew back to Scotland, and we spent our first year of marriage living in Scotland, where she was a nurse, and I served as associate member of one of the Church of Scotland churches. The rest of my time at seminary continued to be very challenging and very enriching, and there are 2 particular memories that I would share with you in particular. If you're interested, I would love to tell you about the professor of Christian ethics who took 2 full class periods, 2 50-minute class periods, to walk us through the meaning and theology of the Christian wedding service. That was a revelation to me, and strongly shaped my understanding of what a Christian marriage is, what a true Christian wedding service is, and certainly shapes my understanding of my own marriage now. I would also love to tell you about literally an internationally respected scholar on Martin Luther, who had to be Lutheran himself. He wrote all kinds of books. He was also a big scholar on Soren Kierkegaard. I mean, just brilliant, brilliant man. But his personal favorite theologian was John Wesley. he loved John Wesley. He thought Luther was wrong, Kierkegaard was wrong, Wesley had the Christian life right for him. And I will never forget the lecture he gave where he talked about what it is that is distinctive about Methodist theology. It was like a door opened up for me about the heritage we have. I'll be honest, I didn't know it when I was there, but it's a powerful story, and it's central to what it means to be a Methodist, at least to me even now. When I graduated from seminary, I was appointed to be the minister of the North Olmsted Methodist Church. It was a new congregation. There was no building, a lot of young families, and we met in elementary school on Dover Center Road. Marty and I had a good time in those years, and we made friends, some with whom we are still very, very close. Happy as I was there, I did miss the academic life. And to help address that, I introduced myself to the chaplain of Baldwin Wallace College. Marty and I very soon became good friends with Jack and with his wife. In 1974, actually at annual conference, he informed me that he was leaving Baldwin Wallace for a new position and wanted to know if I was interested in applying for the chaplain's job there. I was interested, and happily I was hired. I then held several different positions at BW until I retired in 2006. Now let me conclude with some summary comments about what listening to my life has taught me about my own faith. First, a central theme of the great spiritual traditions, especially in the Eastern traditions, is the importance of learning from our pain. Now, someone once said, we in the West tend to think that if life is the way it's really supposed to be, there wouldn't be pain. It's almost as if pain is the fly in the soup of life. But in the West, in the East, in those traditions, there is the assumption that there is no life without pain. Some of those traditions even speak of the gift of pain. Over the years, I think I've begun to try to learn from my pain. And at the very least, doing that has helped me understand the importance of, in the Christian life, of endurance, compassion, spiritual strength, and a courage grounded in faith. Second, I've become convinced that there's one option that is simply not available to persons of the Christian faith, and that is to give up hope. Now, I do not mean hope as in hoping for a new car, or hope as in hoping to win the lottery, or even hoping that someone who is terminally ill is suddenly going to have a miraculous recovery. Let me explain what I mean about never giving up hope this way. I believe that God created every one of us. I believe He put together a unique combination of talents and gifts and limitations in such a way that each one of us can make our own unique contribution to the well-being of the world. No one is exactly like you. No one is exactly like me. And no one, therefore, can bring the same kind of goodness to the world that you alone can bring. I also believe that one of the, if not the greatest joys in life, not happiness, but one of the greatest joys of life, is to have the sense that you are, in fact, being the person God created you to be. That you are bringing into the world the unique gifts that you and you alone can bring. That's my definition of joy, to know that you are being who God meant you to be. However, sometimes painful experiences of life can do great damage to our souls. Sometimes we have done things that we now deeply, deeply regret doing. Sometimes things have been done to us that have brought us lasting scars. And in my experience, when that happens, sometimes we almost get the sense that because those things are now a part of our lives, that any chance of our being that unique person God created us to be, and experiencing the joy of knowing we are being the person God created us to be, because of these terrible things that have happened, that hope is now gone. I think a major message of the Christian faith is that is simply not true. Nothing you have done, or nothing that has been done to you, can ever keep you from being and living as the beloved child of God that you are. One final and practical thought. I especially think of young people who might be hearing these words, but I intend it for all of us. I've come to believe that one of the most powerful ways to nurture your faith is to read some of the great literature of the world. I say that because I believe the Christian faith is ultimately a matter of the heart. And great literature is great because it portrays the hearts of those who are in the novel. In other words, I really believe reading great literature literally trains us to listen to the heart, and our own hearts and the hearts of other people. It lays out for us what I've come to believe is the fundamental struggle in every human heart. For me, the struggle in every human heart is not between love and hate. I've come to believe the struggle is between love and fear. And my most basic assumption in offering this thought to you was captured for me in a few simple words, and I'm embarrassed to say where I first heard it, but I still very, very much believe it. The words were something like this. Anytime you find yourself close to an experience of true and genuine love, watch out. Be very careful, because God is very near. Nothing matures your faith more than sensing that God is very near. Let me close with just 2 examples. When I exercise at home in the morning, I typically listen to readings of great works of fiction, and recently I've been listening to Howard's End by Ian Forster. And one morning this week, as I was listening to it, these few words just jumped out at me. I'm not sure I can remember the context for it, but Forster wrote, quote, "The holiness that lies latent in every human soul," unquote. In my mind, there is profound truth of the Christian faith in those words. There is a holiness in every human soul. But as Forster sadly points out, far too often that holiness is latent. It is inactive within us. To use a phrase that my father often used when he encountered a scene or an experience that just left him not quite sure what to say because it was such a sense of awe and wonder, as in the first time he laid his eyes on his grandchildren. In those moments, he would look and he would simply say, "My, my, my." Well, that was part of my reaction to Forster's words. My, my, my. How different the world would be if all of us could take the holiness that lives within each one of us and bring it to full fruition in our daily lives. Finally, I turned to poetry. I never really understood or appreciated poetry until I came across the writings of Ted Kooser. Anybody know Ted Kooser? Yes, I love Ted Kooser. Kooser was actually in the insurance business for many years, but he always loved to write poetry. And the poems of Kooser's that I like best are where he takes a very simple, ordinary scene and breaks it open to reveal something much deeper going on. One of my favorites is he has 2 women at the perfume counter trying to decide what perfume they want. And you go in and suddenly you see 2 souls there. It's just, I've never run anybody who can do it. Anyway, the title of his most recent book is called Splitting in Order. Let me close, if you'll permit me, by reading it to you. And I would suggest that as you listen to this poem, maybe think of paneras. Think of a pick 2. Let's try that. Splitting in order. I like to watch an old man cutting a sandwich in half, maybe an ordinary cold roast beef on whole wheat bread, no pickles or onion, keeping his shaky hand steady by placing his forearms firm on the edge of the table and using both hands, the left to hold the sandwich in place and the right to cut it surely corner to corner, observing his progress through glasses that moments before he had wiped with his napkin. And then to see him lift half onto the extra plate that he asked the server to bring, and then to wait, offering the plate to his wife, while she slowly unrolls her napkin and places her spoon, her knife, and her fork in their proper places. Then smooths the starch white napkin over her knees and meets her eyes and holds out both hands to him. I read that picture of an elderly couple married for many, many years, who treat themselves to a Panera's lunch one day, and as they carefully sit down, he takes and cuts the sandwich in half. And then I assume they join hands across the table to give thanks to God for this sandwich and for all that they have been given. Honestly, I see a love that almost brings tears to my eyes. And that is usually a sign that God is very, very near. Once again, thank you for the honor of offering these reflections to you. And before we close, I wonder if you and your mother, I go to you. I want to address these 2 people. 2 things. One, you can't, unless you work with, you cannot imagine the work she's gone to make this lecture series possible. I know a little bit about it, but not all of it. And I honestly believe that you're on in this church is something really special to have this kind of lecture series. That's not very often done. And I congratulate all of you, but especially for the incredible work you did. And then there's this lady right here, and her husband, who is not with us, but I have sense is with us. And I wonder if you would join me in expressing our appreciation of these two wonderful people. Question time. Fire away. Let's have some fun. Oh, by the way, my ground rule is ask anything you want to ask if it's a sincere question. If I don't want to answer it for some reason, I'll tell you, but I can't imagine what that would be. So let's have some fun now. Let's talk about it. What do you want to ask? And press me on any. Tell me where you think I'm dead wrong or whatever. Fire away.
I want to hear about the first date.
I thought someone wanted to do that. So the first date. So I get the phone number and I call her. I've never seen her, haven't met her, and she sounds very nice on the phone. And so we set up to go out. It was on a Thursday night, and so I thought that would be great. And I told her I'd pick her up at 7. I hung up the phone, having absolutely no idea what I was going to do that night. But I figured, hey, New Haven has all kinds of movie theaters. There's got to be something going on. Yale has concerts going on. There's got to be something going on. I couldn't find anything. It was like dead night that week. Just nothing was going on, with one exception. The Schubert Theater in downtown New Haven was having a production that I just couldn't think of a more romantic way than start a first date. They were doing a production of the play Ivanov by Chekhov. But it's the only thing I could get a ticket to. So I went over on Thursday night to pick her up, and she lived in, these apartment buildings where there's a door in the center and there's 2 stories. You open the front door, there's an apartment on this side, there's an apartment on this side. You go up some stairs, there's an apartment up there, and there's an apartment up here. I was smart enough to know the numbers to know that she was in the apartment up there. I also had been told that she had a roommate who was also a nurse named Nancy, and they shared that apartment up there. Now, it had been snowing that day, so I'm going up the steps to pick her up for the first time, and my foot slips on the stair. And I fell down and kind of bounced down a few stairs. It took some even years later for her to finally admit to me that when she and Nancy standing by the door heard that, she said to Nancy, "You be Martha." However, Nancy said, "I'm not being Martha, you're Martha." So we went in and I picked her up, and we went down the car, and it was snowing, and I had this little remember the Volkswagen Beetles, and it was a 1962 red one. So I picked her up, and we went down, we got in the car, we're getting in the crane, we're going to this wonderful event called Ivanov by Chekhov. And so we go, and I have to go to a parking lot, public parking lot. And I pull into park, and I pay the young man who's at the door, or at the check, you got to pay him. And I go in, and I park, and I'm getting out for us to go in. He goes in, and he said, "Hey, buddy, you're kind of crooked here. Could you straighten this out for me, please?" I said, "Oh, okay." A little bit embarrassed, but okay. So I backed out, and I pulled it in again. And we're getting out. He said, "Buddy, look at how close you are to this car." He said, "Do you want me to drive this thing for you?" I said, "No, I don't need you to drive it for me." So I pulled out again. I guess the third time I finally got it right. So then we go into the theater. I was on a seminary budget. I did not have a lot of money, so we had tickets fairly high up in the balcony. However, the demand for Ivanov by Chekhov was not very great that night, so we could have moved if we wanted to. So we went into the balcony, and we went to our assigned seats, and nervous as I am, I'm kind of thinking, well, now what do I do? So I thought, well, let's read the programs. So I start to read my program, and suddenly she kind of taps me on the shoulder, and I looked and I said, "Yes." She said, "Could you move down one seat?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but why?" She doesn't say a word, she just points straight ahead. And then I realized she's sitting behind a large pillar with absolutely no view of the stage. That was the first day. You're talking about the nerd of nerds here, and somebody to go. But anyway, yes, that is the story of the first day. And as I say, it's a miracle. 48 years later, and she's still putting up with it. All right. Yes, please.
Hey, Mark, Don Esco.
Yeah, I know Don.
Would you try to use your best thoughts on what it is to live a faithful life?
What it is to live a faithful life.
Yes. I don't want you to be in the car, but...
No, that's good. Let me be serious now.
Yeah.
When I retired from Baldwin Wallace, I started a group at the Berea United Methodist Church. It's kind of an adult discussion group, and Marty and I was talking. We've now finished our 8th year. The first 2 years we did writings from Thomas Merton. 1 year we did one of Buechner's books. Another one we did there was it was last year with Barbara Brown Taylor, right? Yeah. We did Barbara Brown Taylor. We just finished Barbara Brown Taylor. If you don't know about her, she is an Episcopal woman minister, very successful, often been on the radio, been on TV quite a bit. I think an excellent preacher. What's interesting about her right now is her most recent book is called Leaving Church. And she is really struggling with her own faith and so forth. And she's not serving a church right now. But the sermons she wrote, the sermons we looked at, we took one sermon each week. And they were very fruitful and so forth. So let me now go back to your question. What it means to live a faithful life. What's coming to mind, to be honest with you, is an hour before we left to come here today, I was finishing up a book I've been reading that I'm thinking about we might use this coming year. And it's a book by, and I think it's over there, if I'm not, it's there, I think, probably. The Marcus Borg book. Yeah. I can see it.
It is.
Yeah. Marcus Borg is a New Testament scholar, and I'm not sure when it started. Maybe Dan, you can remember, but there's a group called the Jesus Seminar. And I want to say, what, the late 60s or 80s? No, I mean, 80s probably. 80s, yeah. They started, this is a group of first-rate international New Testament scholars who meet, it's a week or 2 weeks, every year in California. And their task is, what is the truth about Jesus? What really happened, etc., etc. And so it's called the Jesus Seminar. And Borg was one of the people who got that started. So the point of my saying all this is I was struck today, the first book that I just finished, if it's of any interest to you. Borg, in his first book, the book is called Jesus. And Borg offers his own views of the truth about Jesus. You know, the joke I made about, come on, in the Sunday school class, did Jesus really walk on water and that kind of thing. Those are the issues he tackles. If you have any interest in it at all, I would say to you, it's not like reading a juicy novel, but it's not terribly esoteric to read. I mean, you got to put some work into it, but if you're interested in that, you can learn a lot from that book. All of which gets back to your question about what it means to live a faithful life. And Borg talks about that. He was talking about it in the section I just finished today. And I think, borrowing from Borg, I would say that Jesus was I remember his words. Borg talks constantly about Jesus being centered in God. And a God who loves us all and who loves the earth. And his life was centered in God. And Jesus was therefore the model of how all of us are called to live lives centered in God. And he talks about the way in which sometimes the church has badly distorted that and so forth. But I guess partly because I just reading that before I came, to live a faithful life is, forgive me for raining, to live a faithful life is one, we have the example of Jesus. I mean, if there's anybody who lived a faithful life, Jesus did. And that is the model, and that is a model we could follow. If you could break that down more, something I said in here. I'm more and more coming to understand that it is to live life, it is to face life honestly and take it the way it comes. The good, the bad, the ugly. It's that business again of learning from our pain. The Christian life is not about, if you follow this path, it's going to be a painless. In fact, if anything, it might be more painful. I think it is about to love. I guess if I could only have one word about what it means to live a faithful life, it is to love. Borg uses the word compassion, which may be a better word than love, because love is a very loaded word. It's to live a life of compassion. Compassion for particularly those who have the least, particularly for those who suffer, and compassion for yourself. To be willing and able to forgive yourself, and to walk that path faithfully. And again, I go back to what I said, and to have the joy of knowing that you are being the person God called you to be. You're making the contribution God created you to make. I think that's part of what it means to be faithful. Is that responsive to the question?
I don't think there is any one response.
No, I don't either. Do you?
Personal to everybody, yeah. But I was asking you.
Yeah, I know. Do you want to press it more?
Not unless somebody else wants. I mean, everybody has their own response to that question.
Yeah, they do. And I think if I'm reading it correctly, Marcus Borg would stand here and forget all my words and say, live your life the way Jesus lived his. And which means center your life in God. And then just let flow from that what flows. Other questions, please.
And what's the context of the word faithful? Why don't you define that for me, please?
Faithful?
Faithful.
Faithful
to what? And
okay. Oh, okay.
All right, faithful.
Let me start. First of all, God is a God of love.
Pardon?
I start with the assumption God is a God of love. As I said earlier on, you and I are here, and the truth that the creation stories told. I'd love to unpack one of those stories for you, but I won't take the time. And the truth that those creation stories told are that the world exists because God longed for someone to love. Our God is a God of love, and so He created the world, and He created us, and that's why we are here. And so, I think if somebody deeply loves you, you respond with love back. And to be faithful is to. It's a good question. Let me just randomly go through some thoughts. I think we may have said this in here, but growing up, I guess that's my hope. Growing up, and I expect in many of your families too, there was a clear sense for Bryce and me of what it means to be a collier. In fact, let me illustrate that. I remember in our teenage years, and every teenager goes through, they kind of push the boundaries, and can we try this, and if we try this, can we try this, and so forth. And so I'd go home on Friday night, or whatever, and I'd say, can I do so-and-so with so-and-so? I always blamed it on John Allen, because he was like, oh, was it John Smithville? And so, anyhow, I would say, and then I'd have one where I knew I was really pushing the boundary pretty far. And my dad, those of you who knew my dad, very, very mild man, very kind, but he had a firm backbone. I mean, you push the wrong button. It was never angry, but it's just clear the way it would be. So I'd say, I want to go to so-and-so with so-and-so, and et cetera, et cetera. Can I go? And my dad would say no. And of course, the inevitable teenage response, why not? Everybody else is going. And the response was, and I can still see it, I picture our kitchen table right now. He'd look at me with his finger and say, I'll tell you why you're not going, because you're a collier, and colliers don't do that. End of discussion. That was it. To be faithful is to be faithful. Let me take one more step. I think I've learned over my life the importance of being faithful to that collier tradition. I mean, it's shaped me very, very much. And I think all of us who claim to be Christians are to be faithful to God. And to just like, just like my dad would have been terribly disappointed in some of the things I might have done, or maybe even did to do. Colliers don't do that, but I might have done it. But I tried not to do anything that would violate that tradition. I tried to be faithful to that heritage. And that's what I think it means. It's not a bunch of rules. It's not a bunch of rules, please.
Well, maybe it's faithful to the truths that we learn, these truths that we learned in the Bible and how Jesus lived, and we don't compromise. I don't know. I need to investigate that word for myself even
Can
further.
I push it a bit further?
Even further.
I think real faithfulness is not to rules. Faithfulness to another is to another being. I mean, for example, the marriage ceremony, that you will faithfully, those words in the marriage ceremony, you will faithfully, etc., etc. Yeah, actually, now think about it, that's a good illustration of what it means to be faithful, now that I think about it. That is, husband and wife are to be faithful to each other, and they've promised to do that in the marriage vows. You and I, when we joined the church, I don't know if we use this language or not, promised to be faithful, to live my life so hopefully I rarely, if ever, disappoint God. And God can look at me and say, someday you've done what I asked you to do. You are the person I wanted you to be. Is that responsive? Okay, let's go more. Other questions? Please.
Mark, I just want to comment on that. That was a beautiful answer. I mean, it just was, as you're thinking it through. We had a magnificent sermon on the words, the voice speaking, saying, "This is my son, my beloved." Mm-hmm. And the takeoff on that ended up, is God proud of you? And I mean, you had that experience with being a collier, as you said. Mm-hmm. But we have to, and we know, don't we? We know if when we do something, I think we know, is God pleased with that? Mm-hmm. And it's on it's really on us to...
Yeah, and just like, let's go back to marriage. For me to be faithful to her does not mean she's written down a set of rules and I'll check you off, you've done this. It's not down the rules. It's down, you've made a commitment to another human being. Now live within that commitment. That's what you would have put. And I think that's what it means to be faithful in the Christian sense. And we have the gift of saying, if we say, well, what is it God wants from us? Then we have the whole scriptures and especially the story of Jesus to teach us that's what God wants. Please.
You mentioned the Iona community in Scotland. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Thank you. I would love to tell you about that. The Iona community was started by a man by the name of Church of Scotland minister named George MacLeod after World War II. It's fascinating how it got started. If you go home and look at your maps and look at Great Britain, off on the west coast of Scotland, you'll see a tiny little island called Iona. And if you can't find it, go to the mainland of Scotland, you'll find a town called Mull, and it's directly across from that. And actually Christianity came from Ireland to Britain with a stop-off at that island. And when the monks stopped off there, back centuries ago, they built an abbey. And it was the center of the Christian faith for Britain for many, 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 many years. So, but as often happens, people didn't care for it. And began to deteriorate, and so there were just kind of these ruins of this abbey that were there for years on this island. But it was a famous abbey. So George MacLeod, church minister, when World War II was over, I want to say I think it was the late, like 49, 50, 51, around in there, he began to notice a pattern in the congregations he served. And the pattern was that on Sunday mornings, the sanctuary was usually filled with a lot of women and very few men. And and that really troubled him. And he couldn't figure out what was going on. And he finally came to the conclusion that, for whatever reason, the church was not speaking to men in those days. So he, creative guy that he was, he decided to do a little experiment. And he got 6 apprentices from the labor unions, and 6 brand new seminary graduates. And he took them off to the island for a summer. And the idea was that these 12 would mingle together and work on reconstructing the Abbey. Well, this first year was a great success. The next year was a great success, and so forth, until finally the Abbey was completely done. And the union people, the apprentices, learned a lot from the seminary students. But even more so, the seminary students realized that all this high fluent theology they knew was not speaking to the guy who went in the next day to work with his lunchbox. It just wasn't speaking. And that's what drove George McLeod crazy. And that's what the Iona community tried to address. That I checked the website a month or so ago. There were 5 disciplines, and I'm not sure I'm going to remember all 5. But in terms of the impact on me, I would mention 2. One is that one of the disciplines of the Iona community to this day is a half-hour of silence each day. That you just sit silently for half an hour each day. So, I mean, I'd heard about it, but I didn't know quite what all it meant. And by the time I got there, the chapel, the Abbey was mostly done, but there was a small chapel building outside that was also completed. So our very first Monday, George McLeod gets there, and I want to say there were like 9 or 10 of us joining that year. And so we were all sitting there in the Abbey, and he says, all right, now we're going to go over to the chapel. And we went over there, and we all sat and kind of rose like this. And he said, now, in this discipline, you will sit here for half an hour. And he said, not a word will be said. You're not going to read. You're not going to listen to music. You're not going to do anything but sit there in silence for half an hour. Think dirty thoughts if you want to. Do whatever you want to do. But you're going to sit there in silence for half an hour. So we all sat there. That first half hour felt like 3 hours to me. I thought this is never going to end. I will tell you, by the end of the summer, that half hour became the most important time of the day for me. And I still value silence a great deal. The second part of it was that Marty and I have often talked about. The day at the Abbey begins. Imagine that the guests and all of us who were members would go into the Abbey itself. Beautiful sanctuary, I mean, just Downton Abbey kind of stuff, you know, it's just gorgeous. So we would go in, and to start the day before breakfast, as soon as you were up, whatever time it was, we went right in there. You didn't go to breakfast first. And it would essentially think of taking the traditional Methodist worship service and go through the worship service right up to where the sermon starts. And when you get to that point, the service abruptly ends. And we all get up and we go do our thing, and we do whatever we have to do that day. At 9 o'clock at night, you come back in, and the same service, picks up right where the sermon would have ended, and you go through the rest of the service, which means the way you lived that day was your sermon. I've never forgotten that. It was just very, very important to me. Thank you for the question. I think other things that were important to me there was, well, I'll tell you what followed up. When the summer was over, in the spirit of working with labor and all that kind of stuff, we were all assigned jobs. And so I was assigned to go to a car factory close to actual, and then let me finish up. Then after that summer, then you go and you work as an associate in the church of a member of the Iona community. So that's where I was. So that's what I was. So I went home, got married, flew back. Marty then was a nurse. She went to work in a hospital in Paisley, Scotland, and I was the assistant minister at this local church. But it was just a really marvelous experience. Other questions, please. Please.
Would you say again, you were speaking about looking at the end of your life.
Mm-hmm. That quote?
Yes, and asking yourself what criteria, would you say that again?
Yeah, if you'll forgive, I want to tell you.
Closer to that piece of my life.
If you'll forgive me, I want to tell you, I love that. I'm so embarrassed, I can't remember his name, but that was a lot of years so ago. Let me picture him first. He came in, and he had to be near retirement. Maybe he was past it for all I know. But anyway, in all my years in school, certainly graduate school and seminary, he's the only one who walked in, had a vest, bow tie, perfect suit. He could put words together like nobody had ever heard before. And he was just lovable. I mean, if you didn't do well in the test, he'd sit and talk to you and encourage you. Now, don't be discouraged. You can do this, etc. And of course, Shakespeare for him, I mean, it just had all the answers of life was right there in Shakespeare. He just loved Shakespeare. So to go back to your question, most of us were seniors, and toward the end of that semester, so we're due to graduate maybe in a couple weeks, he said, and he was kind of timid about this, he said, will you excuse me, please, if I offer a bit of advice to you as you graduate? Or would he sort of say, no, we don't want to hear it? So we sat there. And I did want it, because I love the man. He said, may I suggest that during the course of the rest of your life, every now and then you should stop and ask yourself the following question. When you know your life is coming to an end, what criteria will you use to decide whether or not you lived it well? Still haunts me. Still haunts me. Other questions, please. Oh, come on, we surely didn't shut it down, please.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple times in reference to learning from your pain.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that the Eastern religions actually, like I actually believe this, that the pain is a gift.
They use the word, they use the phrase.
I believe that personally that pain is a gift. Do you believe that? Or
Do I believe what?
the pain is a gift from God?
I'm not ready to say from God, but I do believe pain can be a gift. It really depends upon how we respond to it and how we deal with it. I would say part of that. It hardly began to cover the pain, but part of the reason I told the story about after Bryce's death at the graveside was because to some extent, I literally at that point was thinking about withdrawing my plans to go to Yale. I was blaming it all on God. I was really angry. It just made no. But again, it was my immaturity at the time. But over the years, I think I've begun to learn. My stutter has obviously always often been a very painful experience. Until, along comes that therapist who says, "It's funny, Mark, I didn't think the world came to an end yesterday when you stood up in class and stuttered. I've never forgotten that. That was a gift to me, right there. That's where pain became a gift. Because where he said, you know what, everybody has, what he was saying to me, I thought, was, look, everybody has their problems. And yes, you have one, but everybody does. So now the question is, how are you going to deal with it? And that was part of the gift to me. I think in our culture, in our society, we communicate this image, and I understand it. If life is really good, we'll be like those people on TV who are buying the new cars and going to the great vacation spots and dancing, etc., etc. But I think we in the church know that's not often the way life is, and so you can either bury your pain, and I think even psychologists would say that's not a healthy thing to do. And so the question is, what can you learn from it? And I've come to the point. I've tried to learn from it. Let me transition to that. That is kind of related to this. Again, if you want to hear more about that lecture on the wedding service, we can do that. But essentially, one of the points that professor made was that we tend to think of a wedding service as having two promises made. That is, the bride makes a promise to the groom does quote the vows to the bride. And so those are two promises made. The professor's name was Jim Gustafson. Did you happen to remember him? Jim, okay. Anyhow, he was a Christian ethicist. Brilliant man. And I said he took two full classes. In fact, I'll tell you this story, is that at the end of the second class on the wedding service, I happened to walk out with a friend of mine who had been married 3 months. And so I said, what did you think? He said, all I could think of was, what in the world have I done? I never forgot that. Now I lost track. Remind me what we were talking about.
Wedding.
What?
Wedding.
Wedding. Okay. I do know. Yes. I can build on that thing. There are 2 vows, but the third one, and this is what Gustafson kept pressing on, is in the, you can brought it, but I won't bother to read it. Notice that in the traditional Christian Protestant wedding service, the start is the minister turns to the bride and groom and says to them, if you two solemnly keep the promises you now have made, God will bless your marriage and will grant you fulfillment in it. That's the third vow. So there's a promise from the bride to the groom to the bride, and there's a promise from God to both. That's the third promise. So now how did I get into, the phrase 3 build 1 is a phrase that Marty and I have used a lot ever since our marriage. That is, we believe that it takes 3 to build a marriage, and that's very important to us. And so one of the ways, obviously all that sounds great until you have to live it out, you know, and so forth. And like all people, you know, as far as I know, nobody gets through this life without some conflict with other people in life. Could be people at work, could be family, could be friends, you know, when we get our feelings hurt. So one time, several months ago, we were dealing with that kind of case, Marty and I were. And so I was just frustrated and fuming. And she says to me, we were sitting at the kitchen table, and she looks at me, she said, okay, let's go at it this way. How do we come down to the side of love? And that was very meaningful to me. That really caught me. And that, in ways I'm not sure I can attribute, that to me was another expression of how for us, three build 1. I would never thought of that. And actually it's become something we use pretty frequently now. Okay, how do we come down on the side of love? Love with this. So I rambled about that, but I hope that was helpful. And if I didn't answer the question, take me back again. I'll try it again. What else do you want to ask? Please.
You talk about faith and belief, and you've got the faith side, but on the belief side, you said the equation was intellectual.
Yes.
Could you say what are the intellectual challenges now for us personally in today's world?
As Christians or just as people?
As Christians.
Yeah. I mean, I could think that. The challenges for us intellectually as Christians. That's a very good question. Here's one. As you can tell, I'm grumpy, but it's a brilliant question. I think we may pay a price for too often allowing being a part of the church as kind of boiling down to just be a nice person, you know, do kind things for others, etc., without a kind of intellectual basis for that belief. And I think that weakens the church. Let me go at it. Let me put it this way. That's why I think what you're doing here in this lecture series is really powerful stuff. I don't question for a minute. Every one of you are far better Christians than I am. But as the world becomes smaller, then the intellectual challenges to this, kind of like take back to the 8th grade class. Come on, did Jesus really walk on the water? You know, or did he really walk around after he was crucified? That kind of stuff. Particularly during my work at college, I think students, young people, are having a hard time buying that, and they're not, and we're not coming up with the answers. You know, I think they're saying, "Really?" You know?
Yeah, tell me about it.
and that's again where the Marcus Borg book that I told you about that just finished comes in. He goes through and he literally says, you know, I, Marcus Borg, believe this happened. I believe this was more common to the church than it was an actual thing that actually happened. That kind of stuff. I think there are going to be intellectual challenges to the church in the future, and a lot of I saw it, as I say, at Alden Wallace. Their students would share with me. They're saying, you know, I go to church and they're nice people and I love them, but I don't quite do they really believe all that stuff? And I think that'll be a challenge. Is that responsive to your question? Okay, please.
I just want to respond to what you said because my son said something to me recently that was really profound, and I'm sure all of you have either young grandchildren. I happen to have a lot of coworkers that are in their early 20s, and this generation is really, really angry. And I think that's going to be a challenge for us going forward to model our faith to young people. My son said to me recently, Mom, I said, why are you so angry? And don't get me wrong, he doesn't walk around cursing.
Yeah, I understand.
But I challenged him one day. I said, why are you so angry? And he said, think about it, Mom. He said, the world that I know, that I grew up in, is 9/11. And it humbled me. I said, oh my God. I hadn't really thought about it. And I remember that day. I remember my children coming home from school. But I think that's going to be our challenge going forward, is reaching out to young people. And I noticed that at work, the language that I hear young people using is just horrifying to me because they're so angry. And I want to say to them, like, where are your parents? I just think it's horrific.
I do think that young people are today and say, if this church is all so great, why are we in the mess we're in? You know, and so it's that too. But again, it's also beliefs. Come on, come on. You know.
Maybe they just haven't had good models of unconditional love. I don't know what it is, but I just think that's going to be a challenge.
And I also
for us.
think they probably have had a hard time, somebody who's willing to sit down and engage them in that discussion about the faith. You know, because I think, Frank, sometimes we're not real sure. You know, we do what we've always done all our lives, et cetera, and when somebody comes around to challenge us, we're not really sure what the answer is. And that group that I have out at the Berea Church, we often get to that, and a couple people have said, you know, I never knew that. I didn't know that's what this meant, et cetera, et cetera. And I think adult education in the church is going to be really, really critical. Please.
I'm 68. I work with people that are in their 20s. Their parents are my children's age. Their ideas on things are, and it's not that I'm old-fashioned or anything like that, because I'm very open and I hope I have a very modern mind. Jordan and I have had a lot of experiences and talks about different things that I will tell her how I was brought up and views that I had, not pushing them on her at all, just telling her what went on when I was growing up, that she can't comprehend at all. And I can understand why she hasn't, because there's nothing for her to grab onto to have experienced any of that. And I was raised Catholic. And so some of it this afternoon, she said to me, she said, I really don't like the Catholic religion. And I said, why? And she said, because it's too, we were talking about gray areas of black and white and mortal sin and venial sin and those kind of things, and things that I grew up that have kind of disappeared now. But the kids nowadays, they don't, even in the Catholic religion, they don't have that stuff anymore. There's a lot of things that have really, really changed, and I don't think it's being instilled. There's not the structure or the, I don't know, you know better than I do because you're dealing with, or you were dealing with the college kids and seeing
Yeah. My hope is, and I think.
Mark, I couldn't hear. What was she saying?
She was saying that the world for young people has changed dramatically from the world in which she grew up. And therefore, I'll paraphrase it, correct me if I'm missing it, there's a communication gap because the experiences are so different. And to try to reach across that gap, which they are doing, is a really difficult time. So it's difficult for just the two of them. Imagine what it's like in the church. And I think that was part of it.
Yeah, and we don't, Jordan and I don't argue about it at all. We discuss it. And we have very nice discussions about it. She's very open about it, and she explains how she feels, and I can explain how I feel. It doesn't come about a lot of times. I think in a lot of families, I wish it would. I wish, I know that there's a lot of grandparents that are sitting around here that, I wish they were talking to their grandchildren and not instilling the old, I hate to say old values in them, but I'm not expressing myself.
Yes, you are. Yes,
Correctly, but,
I think you're doing very, very well.
but there's just things that I don't think that they have these strong loyalties and faith. Faith, I think, is, I don't think they have the faith that we grew up being instilled,
I will not put you on the spot, so you don't need an answer. But you can either do a yes or no. Do you think there's any validity if I would respond to that by saying it's because young people, they have relatively fewer good role models of what it means to live by faith?
Wait, what was the question? I'm sorry.
Would you agree
So
that
it's being answered.
would you agree that young people today don't have the kind of role models they need to know what it means to live by faith?
I mean, I think it depends on the group that you're in. Like, I know that our youth group and our discussions are very, very deep, and we do answer a lot of the questions that we have. But I mean, I'm sure there's other, like my friends, they're not in the fitness, but they also have a youth group, and I know that most of their discussions are very superficial. I think it depends on the type of environment you're in. I don't think that's just a big generalization to say that we don't have good role models, because I know that we do. It just depends on the type of people that like we are surrounded with.
Yeah. And you know what, as you were talking, it takes me right back to her and to her, to that class. You know, and I just, you all caught, you know, what we're talking about here is exactly what they did. I mean, as I said to you, if I were to summarize that class, and if I got this wrong, please don't tell me. I've lived with this for many years and I want to believe it. But I mean, what they were essentially saying is, love God with all your heart, but love God with your mind too. Think, ask questions. Don't check your brain at the door when you walk into church, and feel free to challenge. And I think that's also what you're saying too.
Yeah, we do challenge.
And I think that's terribly important. Please.
There are so many denominations of Christians, and some of them take the Bible literally and think they know everything, and that if you don't agree with them, you're wrong. Could you talk to us about how we respond to them?
You know, it's
Or deal with them?
you know, it's really interesting that.
Some of whom are irreligious.
Oh, now we're getting Let me use this example. Martha Ann, I assume you won't disagree with this. Martha Ann, I want to use the example of, well, anyway, I'm going to take a chance. She has a very, very dear friend who she's from Virginia, and she has a friend there now. And the friend has not been an easy life. It's 2 husbands who have died, I think both have died, and so forth. But anyway, they email back and forth. And I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, she was very upset and emailed her around the issue of gays and ordination and gay marriage. And she, as I said, it's a very conservative church, and she was just almost beside herself that the church was thinking about doing this, et cetera, et cetera. So we talked about it, Artie and I did, and we did an email back, where if you want me to, I can try to explain kind of where we are in that issue. But anyhow, so we tried to email back, and the real, I'm sorry. So we emailed back to her, and the real dilemma for us was, we frankly disagreed with her position about that. But this is one of the best Christians, I think. I mean, she if you paid her to be unkind or not generous, she would know how to do it. I mean, she's just loving, and she cares. She loves her church, and she's just this wonderful person. And so I kind of helped write this email back about the issue she had raised about gays in church. And we were both, at least I was kind of concerned as to what kind of response we were going to get. And she emailed back and thanked us very much and kind of politely agreed to not agree. And I think that's an example. And I do think those kind of issues are going to get more and more divisive. And if I have any concerns about the church, well, I have several about the future of the church, but one of them is that inability for us to engage in real dialogue and say to each other, look, I couldn't, my understanding of Scripture couldn't be more different than what you just said. But the one thing you and I have in common is we're both claiming to be followers of Jesus. We're both claiming to live in a relationship with God. Unless I'm wrong, that means for both of us we live a life of love. So the question is, once more, how do I come down on the side of love with somebody with whom I strongly disagree about that issue? And I think that's what we're going to have to do. In some places this has happened, but I've really admired where some communities, particularly the last 2 or 3 years, have started groups like this and bring in some of their Muslim neighbors to come in and talk about what is going on, and do you really believe this? And so I mean to kind of label all Muslims as being represented by ISIS is just wrong. I mean, it's like labeling all Christians as being racist. There's some wonderful, beautiful Muslim people, and so I guess I'm coming to the answer off the top of my head, the wonderful, beautiful people who are Christians, and the wonderful, beautiful people who are Jews, and the wonderful, beautiful people who are Christian, who are Muslims, and the wonderful people who maybe are atheists, need to get together and be wonderful and say, look, we see it differently, but we're bound together by this desire to make the world better. And I think that we need a lot more of that kind of dialogue. Sorry, that almost sounded like a sermon. Yes, sir.
Mark, to the extent that you mentioned, and we all understand that pain is endemic in all of us to some extent, but when there are multiple tragedies in one person or one family, it's very difficult to explain or deal with it, either if you're a family member or a relative or a friend or the church or anything. But how do you suggest that we understand better when things seem to center in this family but not this family or that individual?
Can you repeat what he said?
Tell me if I get this right. Help me with it. The question was, we talked about learning from pain. What do you say to and about people who obviously seem to have had much more than their share of pain? Many tragedies in life. Is that a fair way to put it? Particularly if they're in your family or dear friend. What do you say? I think what you don't say is to offer a quick, easy way of explaining it, particularly by quoting Scripture. You know, I think you don't do that and just kind of have a Bible quote as if that solves it. I frankly think, to put it bluntly, what you do is you shut up and you listen. You love them enough to let them tell you their story and their pain. And often that's about the best gift you can do, is to just be there with them. You know, I think sometimes we think we ought to have something nice or right to say. You know, that, you know, I mean, when there have been tragedies like this, I've had people say to me, what do I say? I said, well, maybe you don't say anything. You just go in and love them and listen and let them know that you love them. Because they know no words are going to heal their pain and make it go away. But you be there for them. Maybe that's the time when you be Christian. It's not so much what you say, it's what you do. And you be there for them. And you'll communicate that you care about their pain. But I think the worst, you know, when we were in Scotland, there was a child who was killed in an accident. I think it was there. And I remember somebody told me that they were going to go see the parents. And I said, what do you think you're going to say to them? And they said, oh, I'm going to assure them that God needed a little angel.
That is what?
And I thought, thank you, no. Thank you, no. That just isn't going to cut it. I mean, again, I think it's very common to with Brent, I was really angry. I was really angry.
Yeah.
And if somebody would have come into me and said, "Oh, it's okay, he's with God now," or "He'll be a doctor in heaven," that's the worst thing they could have said. Don't even come to me. Just let me grieve alone if that's what you're going to do. But fortunately, I had a number of people who didn't do that. I must tell you one story of that. My first Yale, first year at Yale, and Yale always, at least in those days, had a Christmas party. And it was, I don't know, after, there was reception at 5:30 and dinner following that. And I went down, I was okay. We were soon getting ready to come home for Christmas break now. And I went down into the common room at the Divinity School, and I walked in, and a lot of people, and over in the corner, I saw a Christmas tree. And it's just hit me like a brick that I was about to go home and have a Christmas without Bryce. And I just started to lose it. In fact, I get choked up now talking about it. I just started to lose it. And I didn't know what to do. And I looked around, and tears were coming to my eyes. Two guys who were on the floor with me, who knew this story, literally came up, just grabbed me, turned me around, walked me out, took me back to my room, and they sat there for the rest of the night and talked to me. They just didn't go to the Christmas dinner. They just just wanted to be with obviously, I've never forgotten that. Never. And I think that's what we do. We sometimes think being a Christian is not about talking. I sometimes think it's more about loving.
But there's a blame that, you mentioned it too. Everybody goes through a phase maybe where they want to blame God for it or somebody else or whatever.
Yeah.
Can't do that. Can't do that.
Yeah, and as I said, when I think back now,
Sure.
it was just my own immaturity that I sat there and
Sure.
ranted and raved at God.
Yeah.
And I like to think I wouldn't do that now, but I think it's about quietly. I mean, it's like we've heard for all of us growing up in Sunday school and church. It's fine to talk the talk, but walk the walk of faith, which to me is walk the walk of love. Borg in his book, it's interesting. Borg, there's a section where he talks about he doesn't use the word love so much, but he uses the word compassion. And he said Christians are called to live compassionate lives. And that's his whole theme in that book, that Jesus was a model of what it means to be a compassionate person. Which does not mean, of course, as we all know, he didn't get after some people he thought were being pretty unkind people. He called the way he sees it. Any other questions? Yes. I've just gotten the clue. It's time for me to be quiet and sit down. Thank you all. Thank you.